Welcome everybody to Victor's Forbidden Desire. Please do enjoy this next video.
The desert does not forgive weakness. Every man who rides through it long enough learns that truth the hard way, carved into him by sun and silence, and the kind of loneliness that does not announce itself all at once, but seeps in slow, the way cold water finds every crack in a stone wall. Colt Devereaux had been riding 3 days straight when he saw smoke rising from the chimney of the Harlan Ranch. His horse was half dead, his canteen was bone dry, and the thing that frightened him most was not the thirst or exhaustion. It was the reason he had ridden away from everything familiar, chasing smoke on the horizon like a man running from himself. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. 3 weeks before that desperate ride, the Colt Devereaux had been the most envied man in the territory of San Marcos. He had the fastest draw south of the Colorado River. He had a reputation that made outlaws cross the street when they saw him coming. He had a steady job riding for the Callaway cattle operation, good wages, decent food, and every Friday night, the girls at the Red Lantern Saloon saved him a seat and poured his whiskey before he even sat down. Any man in San Marcos would have traded places with him without blinking. Colt knew this, and it made the hollow feeling in his chest all the more confusing, all the more shameful, all the more something he refused to look at directly. It had started the day he rode past the Harlan property for the first time 6 months ago. He had not been paying particular attention to anything except the road ahead and the heat pressing down on him like a hand. But then, he had heard the sound of an axe splitting wood and looked over the fence line and seen Reuben Harlan working in his yard without his shirt, sweat gleaming on broad shoulders, dark hair curling at the nape of his neck, arms moving with the kind of easy power that came not from vanity but from years of honest labor. Colt had looked away immediately. His jaw had tightened. He had ridden faster. He told himself he had not thought about it again. He was lying to himself. Reuben Harlan was 32 years old and ran the most productive small ranch in 3 counties, with nothing but his own 2 hands and a hired man named Doss, who was 70 years old and mostly useful for keeping the books and complaining about his knees. Reuben had come to San Marcos from somewhere back east that he never talked about, bought 40 acres of rocky land that everyone agreed was worthless, and proceeded to make it green through sheer stubbornness and an almost frightening understanding of water and soil. He had no wife. He went to town rarely, and spoke even more rarely when he did go. People called him strange. Colt had always privately thought people called him strange, because they did not know what to do with a man who did not need them. The first time they actually spoke was at the feed store in early spring. And Colt had been loading sacks, and Reuben had come in for seed corn, and they had reached for the door at the same moment, and their hands had brushed, and Reuben had looked at him with gray eyes that were calm and direct and said, "Excuse me," in a low, even voice. And Colt had felt something shift in his chest, like a piece of furniture moved in a room he thought he knew perfectly. He had said nothing intelligible. He had left the feed store and ridden hard for 2 miles before his heartbeat returned to something resembling normal. He tried the saloon girls harder after that. May at the Red Lantern was warm and funny and genuinely kind, and Colt liked her as much as he supposed he was capable of liking anyone. He sat with her on the evenings he came in, bought her drinks, listened to her stories about growing up in Louisiana, and tried very hard to feel the thing that everyone around him seemed to feel when they looked at a pretty woman. He felt warmth. He felt affection. He felt the comfortable ease of her company. He did not feel the thing that woke him up at 3 in the morning with his heart hammering and the image of gray eyes and work-calloused hands burning behind his closed eyes. May was perceptive enough to notice that he was somewhere else even when he was sitting right beside her. One night she had put her hand on his cheek and looked at him with something like gentle sadness, and said, "Honey, whatever it is you're running from, the whiskey is not going to catch it for you." He had laughed and ordered another drink and not gone back to the Red Lantern for 2 weeks. He tried the whiskey harder after the saloon girls stopped working. He was not a drinking man by nature. He had always been careful with it, watched too many good cowboys ruin themselves chasing something at the bottom of a bottle and never finding it. But now he sat at the bar in the evenings and poured himself glass after glass and waited to feel something that made sense, something that fit the shape of the life he was supposed to be living. The whiskey gave him a pleasant blurring of the edges. It did not touch the hollow place. He would wake the next morning with a headache and the same gray eyes waiting for him in the dark behind his thoughts, and he would press his fists against his temples and breathe through it like a man waiting out a storm. The second time he spoke to Reuben Harlan was at the church social in late spring. Colt had not planned to go, but his boss, Wade Calloway, had insisted all his men attend because Wade was courting the preacher's daughter and wanted numbers. Colt had stood near the back with a cup of lemonade and watched the social with the detached attention of a man who was not quite present. Reuben had appeared at his elbow so quietly that Colt had startled, nearly spilling the lemonade, and Reuben had said not one for crowds either in that low, even voice, and it had not been a question. Colt had said no, I suppose not. And then they had stood in silence for a while watching the dancing, and the silence had not been uncomfortable, which was the strangest part, because silence with other people was always uncomfortable for Colt, full of things that needed to be said or filled or navigated. But standing in silence beside Reuben Harlan in the lantern light of the church, social felt like the most natural thing he had done in months. He had excused himself after 15 minutes, and ridden home so fast he had run the horse nearly to blowing. After the church social, he had started avoiding the Calloway South Road because it ran past the Harlan fence line. This helped for approximately 11 days. On the 12th day, Wade Calloway sent him down the South Road specifically to check on a fence section, and Colt had ridden it with his jaw set and his eyes forward and had passed the Harlan property without incident, except that Reuben had been at the fence checking a post and had looked up when Colt rode past and raised one hand in a simple greeting, and Colt had raised his own hand in return, and then had ridden another half-mile before pulling up his horse and sitting very still in the middle of the road and staring at the horizon and trying to understand what was happening to him. He had known men like himself before. He had been 17 years old working a cattle drive through New Mexico when he had understood, on a dark night by the fire watching one of the older hands laugh at something. The specific quality of that understanding sharp and final as a brand. He had spent the next 15 years building a wall around it, not with particular anger or self-hatred, simply with the practical recognition that this was a thing he could not afford to be, not in this territory, not in this life, not with the work he did, and the men he rode with, and the world as it was. He had built the wall carefully and maintained it well, and had almost stopped noticing it was there. He had been comfortable in his constructed life. He had been fine. Reuben Harlan was dismantling the wall without even trying. He was doing it simply by existing, by being in the same territory, by having gray eyes and quiet hands, and that particular stillness that Colt could not stop thinking about. Colt hated him for it, briefly and unfairly. Saw the way a man hates the weather for being what it is. The third time they spoke was at the blacksmith's in early summer, and this time Colt's horse threw a shoe, and he had to wait, and Reuben was also waiting on some ironwork, and there was nowhere to go, and nothing to do but stand in the shade outside the blacksmith's, and exist in proximity to each other. They talked about water tables for 20 minutes. Reuben had opinions about water tables that were deeply thought through and interesting in a way that Colt had not expected, and Colt had found himself asking questions and listening to the answers with genuine attention. And at some point, he had realized that he was leaning against the post with his arms crossed and his shoulder half turned toward Reuben in the unconscious posture of a man who is pulled toward something without meaning to show it. He had straightened up immediately. Reuben had glanced at him with those gray eyes and said nothing, but something in his expression had shifted just slightly, a barely perceptible change that could have meant anything or nothing, and Colt had thought about it for 3 days afterward. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in late summer. Colt had ridden past the Harlan place without planning to stop. He had told himself he was checking the road condition after the heavy rain. He had told himself this was completely ordinary and professional and had nothing to do with anything else. He had slowed his horse near the gate. Reuben had been at the well, hauling water, and had looked up, and their eyes had met across 40 feet of dusty ground, and Reuben had held his gaze for a long moment before going back to his work, and Colt had felt the entire wall come apart in his chest like a dam given way, a sensation so overwhelming it was almost physical, almost painful, a rushing release of everything he had been holding back for 15 years, and particularly for the last 6 months, and specifically since gray eyes and quiet hands, and the particular quality of a silence that felt like company. He had ridden away so fast, his horse must have thought they were being chased. That night, he had sat in his bunk in the Calloway bunkhouse and stared at the ceiling and tried to breathe and thought about May's words. "Whatever it is you're running from, the whiskey is not going to catch it for you." He had tried the saloon girls. He had tried the whiskey. He had tried hard work and longer hours and avoiding the South Road and telling himself he was fine and building the wall higher, and the wall was rubble now. And he was sitting in the middle of it at 11 o'clock at night in a bunkhouse full of snoring cowboys, and he was 34 years old, and he had never in his life been so scared of anything as he was scared of riding up to the Harlan Gate in daylight and standing there and being seen. He lay awake until past midnight. He made himself a promise he knew he was going to break. He fell asleep finally and dreamed of gray eyes and quiet and the sound of an axe splitting wood. He broke the promise 2 days later. He did not go to the gate. He rode 3 days in the opposite direction instead, north toward the Mora Basin, telling Wade Calloway he had personal business to attend to, which was technically true in the way that a man running from a prairie fire has personal business to attend to. He rode hard the first day and camped rough the second night, and on the third morning he sat by the ashes of his fire with his coffee cup in his hands and stared at the land around him and understood, with the cold clarity that comes at 3 in the morning or at the end of 3 days of running, that there was nothing in this direction. There was nothing anywhere except the thing he had left behind. The hollow place in his chest had not shrunk. It had expanded. It had taken up most of his available interior space. He could not breathe around it. He turned his horse south. He rode hard for 3 days. He arrived at the Harlan Gate at dusk with a half-dead horse and an empty canteen, and shaking hands and the absolute certainty that he was making a terrible mistake and the absolute inability to stop himself. He tied his horse at the gate and walked up to the door. He knocked. For a long moment there was nothing. Then he heard movement inside, and the door opened and Reuben Harlan stood there in the fading light with his sleeves rolled up and a look on his face that was not surprise. That was the thing that undid Colt entirely. That Reuben did not look surprised, that those gray eyes took him in from hat to boots and back up again, and held a quality that was not surprise, something quieter and more carefully held, something that had been waiting without expecting to be answered. Colt opened his mouth. What came out was not anything he had planned. He said, "I tried saloon girls." He said, "I tried whiskey." He said, "Nothing works." He stopped. His jaw was tight. His hands were shaking slightly at his sides, and he hated that they were shaking and could not make them stop. Reuben looked at him for a long moment. The evening wind moved through the grass behind Colt, and the last of the light was going amber and gold across the flat land, and somewhere a horse nickered. Then Reuben stepped back from the door and held it open wider. The gesture simple and unhurried. The way he did everything. The way a man moves who has made a decision without conflict. "Come in," Reuben said. "Your horse looks like it needs water." Colt stepped inside. The cabin was small and neat, and smelled of wood smoke and coffee and something that was simply Reuben. And some particular quality of a life lived deliberately and alone, and it hit Colt in the chest like a hand pressing flat against his breastbone. He took off his hat. He held it in both hands. He did not know what to do with himself. Reuben moved to the stove without ceremony and poured a cup of coffee and set it on the table and said, "Sit down before you fall down." And Colt sat down at the wooden table and wrapped both hands around the cup and tried to find the steady place inside himself that he had always been able to find before. He could not find it. Everything in him was moving, not outwardly. He was sitting very still, but underneath, Everything was moving in the direction of the man standing with his back to him, pouring his own coffee. Reuben sat across from him at the table. They looked at each other. 3 days, Reuben said, without inflection. Colt blinked. What? Reuben turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. You left 3 days ago. I saw you riding north on the Moore Road. Colt absorbed this. He said, You noticed. Reuben's eyes held his. I notice. The 2 words landed somewhere in Colt's chest and stayed there. He looked down at his coffee. He said, I don't know what I'm doing here. Reuben said, You know? The certainty in it was not arrogant. It was simply true, the way Reuben said things, without embellishment, without the social softening that most men applied to hard truths. Colt had noticed this about him from the beginning, that he spoke as though words were valuable and should not be wasted on anything except what was actual. Colt had always spoken the same way himself, or tried to. But right now, sitting at this table with his hands shaking around a coffee cup, he felt entirely incapable of the direct plainness that was second nature to Reuben. He said, It's not a small thing. Reuben said, I know it's not. He said, You understand what I'm saying to you. Reuben said, Yes. Colt looked up. The gray eyes were steady and clear, and held something that Colt recognized because he had seen it in his own chest without ever being able to look at it directly. The careful, sustained weight of something real that had been carried quietly for a long time. He said, How long? Reuben was quiet for a moment. He said, Since the feed store in March. Colt set down his cup very carefully. He said, That's 6 months. Reuben said, Yes. Colt pressed his hands flat on the table. He said, And you never. Reuben said, It wasn't mine to start. That was it, precisely. The thing that Colt had never been able to name, but had always understood about the way this particular thing worked, the specific architecture of waiting, the courtesy of letting the other man find his own door. He felt something in his chest that he did not have a word for, a quality of being seen that was both terrifying and deeply, fundamentally the opposite of the hollow place. He said, I rode 3 days away and 3 days back. Reuben said, I know. He said, That should tell you something. Reuben's hands were still around his cup. He said, It tells me a great deal. The fire in the stove ticked and settled. Outside, the wind moved through the grass. The light was fully gone now, and the cabin was warm, and the lamplight was amber, and Colt was aware of every inch of the distance across the table, aware of it with an intensity that pressed against the back of his throat. He said quietly, I built a very solid wall. Reuben said, I know. I watched you build it faster every time I came near. Colt laughed. It came out rough and surprised and not particularly controlled. He said, Was I that obvious? Reuben said, Only to me. Only to me. Colt turned the words over. He said, How? Reuben said, Because I was doing the same thing. The space between them at the table was not large. Colt was aware of Reuben's hands on the table, the rough work-made quality of them, the particular steadiness. He was aware of his own hands, still flat against the wood, no longer quite shaking but close. He said, I have never done this. Reuben said, I know. He said, meaning I don't know how it. Reuben said, Neither do I, precisely. Colt looked at him. He said, You. Reuben met his eyes. He said, I have known what I am for a long time. I have never found anyone that made me want to be reckless about it. The word reckless landed in Colt's chest and lit something there, small and dangerous as a match in a dry summer, and he breathed in slowly and said, And now. Reuben looked at him steadily. He said, And now you rode 3 days in the wrong direction and 3 days back. He said, That is a fairly compelling argument. Colt's hands turned over on the table. He said, Reuben. Reuben said, Yes. He said, I'm terrified. Reuben said, So am I. He said, That's not helpful. Reuben said, No. He said, It's true, though. Colt looked at the man across the table, the gray eyes and the steady hands and the particular quality of being exactly what he was, without apology or performance, and felt the hollow place in his chest doing something it had never done before, filling slowly, painfully, the way circulation returns to a cold limb, not comfortable, not painless, but unmistakably alive. He stood up from the table. Reuben looked up at him without moving. Colt moved around the table. He stopped when he was standing beside Reuben's chair. He could feel the warmth of him from here, the particular gravity of a person who is very still and very real and very present. His heart was doing something unreasonable in his chest. His hands were at his sides. He said, "I don't know how to start." Reuben tilted his face up to look at him. The lamplight was on the strong line of his jaw and the gray of his eyes and the quiet in him that Colt had been orbiting for 6 months, like a man walking around a fire trying to decide if he was cold enough to stop being afraid of the flame. Reuben said, "You already started." He said, "You started when you knocked on the door." Colt reached out. His hand found Reuben's shoulder, the solid reality of it, the warmth through the fabric of his shirt, and the touch was nothing, and it was everything. It was the simplest and most frightening thing he had ever done in 34 years of a life that had included gunfights and cattle drives and a war, and any number of genuinely dangerous situations that had never made him feel anything like this. Reuben's hand came up and covered his. The contact moved through Colt like a current, steady and deep, the kind of feeling that does not announce itself loudly, but settles into the bones and says this. This is what was missing. This is the shape of the thing you could not name. They stayed like that for a long moment. Colt's hand on Reuben's shoulder, and Reuben's hand over his, and the fire in the stove, and the wind outside, and the lamp burning amber, and the whole vast quiet territory around them holding its breath. Then Reuben stood. He was nearly the same height as Colt, within an inch, and when he stood, they were very close, and Colt could feel the warmth of his breath and see the gray of his eyes clearly in the lamplight and the particular quality of waiting that lived in them. Not patient exactly, because there was nothing passive about it. More like something held carefully at very high tension. Always something that had been held that way for a long time and was very close to the end of its capacity for restraint. Colt said his name again. Just Reuben, nothing more. Reuben said, "Yes," and something in the word, in the single syllable of it, in the way it came out low and rough and nothing like his usual evenness, undid the last of whatever Colt had been holding himself together with. He closed the remaining distance between them. What happened in the amber lamplight of Reuben Harlan's small cabin on a Tuesday evening in late summer was 34 years of a wall coming down, was 6 months of carefully maintained distance collapsing all at once, was the specific and irreversible nature of the thing Colt Devereaux had spent the better part of his adult life refusing to look at directly. And it was overwhelming in the way that only true things are overwhelming, not dramatic or theatrical, but simply and completely real. Two men finding each other in the plain light of a lamp with the wind outside and the fire ticking and the whole empty territory around them not caring in the least. It was the most frightened Colt had ever been. It was the least hollow he had felt in 15 years. He was shaking again at some point, and Reuben's hands were steady on him, grounding. The specific quality of steadiness that Colt had sensed in him from the beginning. And he understood that this was what it was, to be held by someone who was actually present, not performing warmth, not offering what they thought was expected, simply there, simply real. Simply the person who had noticed him riding north on the Moore Road and had waited 3 days without knowing if waiting would be rewarded. Much later, the fire had burned low and the wind had quieted, and Colt was sitting with his back against the wall of the cabin, and Reuben was beside him, and they were close enough that Colt could feel the rise and fall of his breathing and the warmth along his side, and neither of them was speaking because nothing needed to be said right at that moment. Colt thought about the wall. 15 years of it. All the Friday nights at the Red Lantern, all the whiskey, all the riding fast away from things. All the mornings with his jaw tight and his fists pressed to his temples. All the carefully not looking. He said quietly, "I wasted a lot of time." Reuben said, "You took the time you needed." Colt said, "That's generous." Reuben said, "It's accurate." Colt tilted his head back against the wall. He said, "What happens now?" Reuben was quiet for a moment. He said, "What do you want to happen?" Colt looked at the ceiling of the cabin, the rough-hewn beams, the particular solidity of something built by hand with intention. He said, "I don't know how to do this." He said, "I don't know the rules of it." Reuben said, "Neither do I." He said, "I think we make them." Colt absorbed that. He said, "Out here," Reuben said. "Out here, it's mostly just us and 40 acres and old Doss, who has the eyesight of a bat and the interest of a man whose primary concern is his own knees." Colt laughed again. More real this time, less surprised. He said, "That's a very practical argument." Reuben said, "I am a practical man." He was. That was one of the things. That was one of a great many things. Colt said, "I'd need to give notice to Wade Calloway." Reuben said nothing. The silence had a quality of very careful stillness. Colt looked at him. He said, "If the offer were on the table, of something more permanent than tonight." Reuben met his eyes. He said, "The offer is on the table." Colt said, "I've got skills." He said, "I can work." Reuben said, "I know you can work." He said, "I've been doing the work of 2 men for 4 years." He said, "The south fence alone would benefit substantially from a second pair of hands." Colt said, "That's the least romantic thing anyone has ever said to me." Reuben said, "You strike me as a man who prefers the practical." Colt said, "You strike me as a man who is hiding behind the practical right now." Reuben was quiet. Then he said, "Yes." He said, "Somewhat." Colt said, "What would you say if you weren't hiding behind the practical?" A long pause. The wind outside. The low fire. Reuben said, "I would say that I have been on this land for 4 years, and I have made it what I wanted it to be, but I have not made it what I wanted it to be, because what I wanted it to be included someone, and I had stopped believing that was possible." He said, "I would say that I noticed you in the feed store in March, and I have not stopped noticing since." He said, "I would say that watching you ride north 3 days ago was one of the harder things I have done recently, and I did not allow myself to believe you would come back." Colt looked at him, the gray eyes in the low light, the careful plainness of him. He said, "I came back." Reuben said, "You came back." Outside, the territory was enormous and dark and mostly indifferent, and the nearest neighbor was 4 miles distant, and the law in San Marcos was primarily interested in cattle theft and unpaid bar tabs, and had no particular attention to spare for a small ranch 40 acres off the South Road. Inside the cabin, the fire was low, and the lamp was amber, and 2 men sat close in the particular warmth of something that had been a long time coming, and had arrived finally without fanfare, without drama, simply by a man knocking on a door and saying nothing works and meaning, "I am here." Colt settled his shoulder more firmly against Reuben's. He said, "The south fence." Reuben said, "It's in poor condition." He said, "I've fixed worse." Reuben said, "I believe you." He said, "I'll need to ride back to Calloway's tomorrow. Give proper notice." Reuben said, "Yes." He said, "That's a week. Probably, maybe 2. Reuben said, "I've waited 6 months." Colt said, "Point taken." They were quiet again. The good kind of quiet, the kind that does not need filling, the kind that Colt had only ever found standing beside this particular man at a church social in the spring with lemonade in his hand, and no idea what he was walking into. He was 34 years old. He had tried saloon girls. He had tried whiskey. He had ridden 3 days in the wrong direction and 3 days back. He was sitting with his shoulder against the shoulder of a man with gray eyes and quiet hands, and 40 acres of rocky land that he had made green through stubbornness, and the hollow place in his chest, for the first time in 34 years, was not hollow. Outside, the wind moved through the grass of the Harlan Ranch, and the stars came out over the territory, vast and indifferent and beautiful. And inside, the lamp burned lower, and the fire settled into coals, and 2 men sat in the plain warmth of a thing that was real and frightening and completely, irrevocably worth every mile of the road that had brought them to this door. Colt did not sleep that night, not from restlessness or the old familiar anxiety, but from the opposite of it, from a kind of wakefulness that was not distressing but alert, the way a man stays awake watching something rare that he does not want to miss. He lay listening to the sound of Reuben's breathing and the wind outside and the occasional shift of the horse in the small barn at the side of the property, and thought about the strange and specific path that had led him here, to this cabin, to this man, to this Tuesday night that felt like the end of something, and the beginning of something, and both at once. He had spent 34 years understanding himself as a man who traveled alone. Not unhappily, he had told himself, not with particular deprivation. Alone was simply the condition of his life, the geography of it, the shape it had taken and the shape he had believed it would always hold. He had friends in the loose frontier sense, men he trusted in a fight, men he could drink with and share a fire with and rely on in the practical crises that life on the open range produced. He had May's kindness on Friday nights. He had the particular satisfaction of good work done well in the saddle and on the fence line. He had the land, which was always there, always honest, always returning exactly what you put into it in sweat and attention and stubborn persistence. He had thought that was enough. He was beginning to understand, lying awake in the darkness of Reuben Harlan's cabin, that he had been wrong about that in the specific and fundamental way, that a man is wrong about something not from stupidity, but from never having had a point of comparison. Reuben shifted slightly beside him. His hand in sleep had found the edge of Colt's sleeve and held it loosely, the grip of someone who was not by nature a clinging person and whose hands, even in unconsciousness, maintained a quality of restraint. And not absence, but carefulness, the same carefulness that characterized everything else about him. Colt looked at those hands in the dimness, the roughness of them, the sureness of them, and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire, and everything to do with the specific miracle of being chosen by someone who was particular about what they chose. He thought about what it would mean to ride back to Calloway's tomorrow and give notice, proper notice, 2 weeks at minimum, because he was not a man who walked out on an obligation. He thought about what it would mean to come back. The thought did not frighten him the way he would have expected. He had anticipated a continuing roar of fear. Instead, what he felt was something quieter, something more like the feeling after a long and difficult climb, the specific exhaustion and rightness of standing on the ground you work to reach. He had ridden 3 days away and 3 days back. He had knocked on a door. He was still here. And in the warm darkness of a cabin that smelled of wood smoke and coffee and the man beside him, the hollow place in his chest held something other than emptiness. For the first time in 34 years. He closed his eyes and let himself rest inside that truth and did not run from it even once. He was gone before sunrise. Colt had not meant to leave without waking Reuben. He had told himself he would say something. Find some adequate word for the shape of what had happened in that cabin on a Tuesday night in late summer. Something plain and honest, the way Reuben himself was plain and honest. But when the gray light began at the window and he looked at the man beside him, the stillness of him in sleep, the particular quality of a face without its usual careful composure, open in the way faces are only open when their owners believe themselves unobserved, he found he could not make himself disturb it. He lay watching for a few minutes, and felt something press against the back of his throat that he did not trust himself to handle. In the open air of a cabin at 5 in the morning, he got up quietly. He found his hat and his jacket. He stood at the door for a long moment with his hand on the latch and his back to the room, and breathed through the tightness in his chest. Then he let himself out into the cool dark of the early morning and went to his horse and rode south toward Calloway's without looking back once. He did not look back, because if he looked back, he would not go. He understood this about himself clearly and without drama. The pull of that cabin and the man in it was the strongest thing he had felt in years, and he needed the road between them to think clearly. To do what he needed to do in the ordered fashion, that was the only way he knew how to do anything. He would give Calloway proper notice. He would work his last days cleanly. He would come back. 10 days was the number he had said. He intended to be back in 8. The ride to Calloway's was 4 hours on a rested horse. Colt spent most of it in a silence that was different from his usual riding silence. He was carrying the previous night in his chest, and it sat there differently from anything he had ever carried before. It was not light. It was not simple. But it was real in a way that very few things in 34 years had been real, and he was not putting it down. Wade Calloway was eating breakfast when Colt knocked at the ranch house door. He was a large man with a genuine heart buried under frontier pragmatism, and he looked at Colt for a long moment after Colt said what he had to say, and then he poured a second cup of coffee and pushed it across the table and said, "Sit down, son, and tell me where you're going." Colt sat down. He said, "I'm going to work the Harlan place," he said. "I've made an arrangement with Reuben Harlan." Wade was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup on the table. He said, "Harlan's a good man. Keeps himself to himself, but a good man. Good land, too, once you know what to do with it, and it seems he does." Colt said, "Yes." Wade said, "This a permanent thing?" Colt said, "Yes." Wade looked at him steadily. He said, "You've been restless. I noticed it. I don't pry into a man's business, but I noticed it," he said. "You look different this morning," Colt said. "I expect I am different." Wade nodded slowly. He said, "I can have Perkins from the South Crew cover your work inside a week." He said, "You give me 7 days and we'll call it square." He said, "You've been a good hand, and I don't want you going out on anything but good terms." Colt said, "7 days." He said, "Thank you, Wade." Wade said, "You take care of yourself out there," he said. "A man needs something worth working for. I'm glad you found yours." Colt wrapped both hands around the cup and thought about another cup of coffee on another table and said nothing because nothing needed to be said. The 7 days were the longest of his recent memory. He worked them fully and cleanly, the way he had always worked, without complaint or distraction, fixing fence and moving cattle and doing everything asked of him. At night, he lay in the bunkhouse and stared at the ceiling and listened to the snoring of men he had known for years, and thought about gray eyes and quiet hands, and the specific weight of a sleeve held in sleep. He did not go to the Red Lantern. He had no interest in the Red Lantern. The wanting that had driven him there Friday after Friday was simply gone, replaced by something more specific and real, a wanting that had a precise location and a name and 40 acres of rocky land made green. On the 3rd day, a man named Cruz from the neighboring Ashby outfit stopped at the water trough and mentioned in passing that Fletcher Dane, son who ran the largest cattle operation in the Southern Territory, had sent 3 of his hired hands to have a conversation with Reuben Harlan about the Harlan water rights. Harlan had sent them back without the conversation. It had been brief. Colt kept his face even. He said, "When was this?" Cruz said, "Day before yesterday." Colt thanked him and went back to work, and that night did not sleep at all. He thought about Reuben alone on that land with old Doss and his approximate depth perception, and Fletcher Dane, who had built his operation on the understanding that persistence was more persuasive than legal niceties. He almost rode out on the 4th day. He made himself stay because he had given his word, and because Reuben had managed 4 years alone and was entirely capable of managing 3 more days. He mostly believed this. On the 7th day, he shook Wade Calloway's hand and collected his wages and packed his saddlebag in 20 minutes because he owned very little and had always lived that way. May happened to be in the yard when he rode out and gave him a look that was warm and knowing and completely without surprise, and Colt touched the brim of his hat to her, and she laughed and called out, "Ride careful." He rode careful. He made the 4 hours in 3.5. The Harlan gate was closed when he arrived in the afternoon light. He dismounted and opened it, and rode through and closed it behind him. The action of a man who was not leaving. Reuben was at the north end of the property, crouched beside the irrigation channel with his sleeves rolled and his hands in the dirt, working at a blockage with the focused attention of a man for whom problems were simply things to be solved. He looked up at the sound of hooves. He looked at Colt on the horse with the full saddlebag. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, 7 days. Colt said 7 days. Reuben stood up and wiped his hands on his thighs. He said, "I expected 8. Colt said, "I told you 7. Reuben said, "Yes." He said, "I didn't entirely believe you." Colt swung down from the saddle. He stood in the afternoon light with the reins in his hand and looked at Reuben Harlan, the work-dark hands and the gray eyes, and the quality of a man who had been waiting without making a performance of it, simply getting on with the irrigation channel and being present when the person he was waiting for arrived. The hollow place in his chest filled back in with the abrupt completeness of water returning to a dry vessel. He said, "I heard Fletcher Dane sent men." Reuben's expression did not change except in the way it slightly tightened at the corners. He said, "Yes," Colt said, "and..." Reuben said, "And I told them the land was not for sale, and they left." He said, "That simply." Reuben said, "I was fairly direct about it." Colt looked at him. He said, "Dane won't leave it at 3 men." Reuben said, "I know." He said, "You understand what he's after, the Northeast Creek." Reuben said, "I understand." He said, "I've been expecting something of this kind since I filed the water rights last spring." He said, "Water out here is worth more than gold, and Dane has been buying up every acre between here and the southern hills." He looked at Colt steadily. He said, I did not plan to mention this before you decided." Colt said, "You should have mentioned it." Reuben said, "I didn't want it to be a factor in whether you came." The directness of it landed in Colt's chest the way Reuben's words always landed, without softening, without evasion, simply as the thing that was true. He stood with the reins in his hand and looked at the man who had deliberately withheld a relevant and dangerous piece of information to ensure that Colt's decision was made freely. He said, "Reuben." Reuben said, "Yes." He said, "You are the most maddening man I have ever met." Reuben said, "You've mentioned something like that before." He said, "It was a compliment both times." Reuben's mouth did something that was not quite a smile but lived in the same territory. He said, "Come and look at this irrigation channel. I've been fighting a root blockage for an hour, and I'd value a second opinion." Colt tied his horse to the fence post and crouched beside the channel, and they worked the blockage free together in 20 minutes, their hands in the cold water and the afternoon light on their backs, and the land around them quiet and large and present. It was the most ordinary thing in the world. Colt was aware of it as extraordinary with every minute of it. That evening, old Doss ate supper with them and talked at considerable length about his knees and a horse he had owned in 1863 and a woman in Tucson he had not thought about in years and was now thinking about again. And Colt listened with genuine attention and answered when answers seemed called for, and Reuben refilled everyone's coffee without being asked, and the 3 of them sat in the warm kitchen of the small cabin, and the fire went down to coals, and eventually Doss took himself off to the small room at the back of the barn that he had occupied since Reuben had taken on the property, and the cabin was quiet again. Colt washed the cups. Reuben dried them. They stood at the small kitchen table afterward in the lamplight, and Reuben looked at him with the gray eyes that saw exactly what was there, and said, "You stayed 7 days." Colt said, "I told you I would." Reuben said, "I know." He said, "It was a long 7 days." Colt said, "Yes." He said, "For me too." Reuben set down the cloth. He said, "I am not a man who has much practice at this." Colt said, "Neither am I." He said, "I should tell you that. I have known what I was for a long time, but I have had no practice at allowing it to be anything more than a private fact." He paused. He said, "I may not always know the right thing to do." Reuben looked at him. He said, "I may not either." He said, "I expect we'll manage." Colt said, "You're very calm about this." Reuben said, "I'm not calm." He said, "I have been considerably less than calm for the past 7 days." He said, "I have redug sections of the irrigation channel that did not need redigging because I needed something to do with my hands." Colt looked at him. He said, "The channel looked fine when I arrived." Reuben said, "It is extremely fine. It is the finest dug channel in the territory." He said, "I have had a great deal of energy to direct somewhere." Colt crossed the small distance between them. He put his hand on the side of Reuben's jaw the way he had done that first night. The rough warmth of him, the realness of him. And Reuben turned his face very slightly into the touch the way a man moves toward warmth without thinking about it. And the gesture was so unguarded and so unlike Reuben's usual careful composure that Colt felt the breath go out of him completely. He said quietly, "I'm here." Reuben said, "Yes." He put his hand over Colt's. He said, "You're here." What was between them in the lamplight of the cabin kitchen was not dramatic. It was quieter than that and more complete. 2 men who had spent most of their lives alone, finding each other in the plain, ordinary space of a kitchen after supper, the cups washed and drying, the fire going to coals. The want in it was real and deep and moved through Colt like the current in the irrigation channel, steady and purposeful, and finding its way by the simple logic of gravity toward the place it was always going to go. And Reuben was steady even now, steady in the way of a man who has decided and does not waver, whose hands were certain and whose gray eyes held the same unhurried presence they held in every other moment, only concentrated now, only fully trained on Colt in a way that made him feel seen in his bones. The lamp burned down, the fire went cold. Neither of them noticed for a long time. Fletcher Dane came personally on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after Colt had moved his saddlebag into the Harlan cabin. He came with 4 men and a lawyer in a good coat who carried a leather satchel and had the look of a man accustomed to the intimidating effect of legal documents in frontier territories where most people could not afford their own counsel. Dane himself was large and silver-haired and had the particular manner of a man who had been persuasive for so long he had stopped distinguishing between persuasion and command. He pulled up at the gate and called out in the tone of a man who expected doors to open at the sound of his voice. Colt was on the roof of the barn when they rode up, replacing the section of shingles that had been worrying Reuben. He heard the voice and came down the ladder with his hammer still in his hand and stood in the yard. Reuben came from the house. The old Doss appeared from the direction of the cattle pen and stood at a distance with an expression of interested neutrality. Dane looked at Colt for a moment. He had clearly been expecting to deal with one man alone, and the presence of a second gave him a brief pause that he covered smoothly. He said, "I'm looking for Reuben Harlan." Reuben said, "You found him." Dane smiled. The smile was practiced and expensive. He said, "Mr. Harlan, I've come to make you a genuine and fair offer on this property." He nodded at the lawyer who opened the satchel. "My man here has drawn up the papers. I think you'll find the price more than generous for land of this quality." Reuben stood with his hands easy at his sides. He said, "I appreciate the personal visit, Mr. Dane." He said, "The answer is no." He said, "It was no when your men came 3 weeks ago, and it's no today." Dane's smile remained. He said, "I wonder if you've fully considered your position out here." He said, "A small operation, 1 man and some acreage, the costs of maintaining water rights alone in this territory." He said, "My offer would allow you to set yourself up very comfortably, somewhere less demanding." Reuben said, "I'm not looking for somewhere less demanding." He said, "This is my land, and I intend to keep it." Dane looked at Colt then. He said, "And who are you?" Colt said, "I work this land." Dane said, "For wages." Colt said, "For reasons of my own." Dane absorbed this with the calculating attention of a man sorting information. He said, "Harlan, I want you to understand that I am trying to conduct this in a civilized fashion." He said, "The water rights attached to this property are critical to the development of the southern range." He said, "I intend to have them." He said, "I would prefer to pay for them fairly." Reuben said, "I understand you clearly, Mr. Dane." He said, "The water rights are part of this land, and this land is not for sale." He said, "If you'd like to discuss a water sharing arrangement that respects both properties, I am open to that conversation." He said, "If you've come to buy me out, you've had a long ride for nothing." Dane looked at him for a long moment. The practiced smile was entirely gone. What was under it was not rage, which would have been easier, but the cold, flat patience of a man who had won enough times to know that initial refusals were simply a step in a longer process. He said, "I'll give you time to reconsider." He nodded to his men. They turned their horses. The lawyer closed his satchel and followed without a word. When the sound of hooves had faded, Colt set his hammer down and looked at Reuben. He said, "He's not done." Reuben said, "No." He said, "The water-sharing offer was genuine. The creek serves both properties. Dane doesn't want an arrangement. He wants ownership. Those are different things." Colt said, "He'll come back with more pressure." Reuben said, "I expect so." He said, "I have better resources now than I did 3 weeks ago." Old Doss said from near the cattle pen, "My knees predicted this." He went back to the cattle pen. Colt said, "His knees." Reuben said, "They've been right twice." Colt picked up his hammer. He said, "I should finish the roof." He paused. He said, "Reuben, thank you for being here," when he rode up. Reuben said, Thank you for being here when he rode up. He said, the shingles on the east section need checking as well. Colt went back up the ladder. Dane came back on a Wednesday, 2 weeks later. This time there were 6 men and no lawyer. They came at dusk, which was itself a kind of statement, the frontier language of men who wanted the darkness on their side. Colt saw them first from the porch, where he had taken a habit of sitting in the evenings, watching the land go from gold to amber to gray. He stood and called Reuben's name, and Reuben appeared at the door and said quietly, "Go and tell Doss to stay in the barn." Colt went. Doss said his knees had been indicating this all day and settled himself on his stool with the philosophical calm of a man of 70 who has outlasted a great many things. Colt came back to the porch and stood beside Reuben. The 6 men pulled up at the gate. None of them were Dane. These were hired men with the flat eyes and settled postures of people paid to be persuasive in the physical sense. The one at the front was large across the shoulders and wore his gun low and easy. He said, "Mr. Dane has reconsidered his offer and improved it considerably." He said, "He'd like an answer tonight." Reuben said, "My answer hasn't changed." The man at the front said, "Perhaps you'd like to discuss it more privately." He looked at Colt with the assessing gaze of someone calculating whether Colt was a complication. Colt looked back at him with the flat, steady eyes of a man who had ridden through a war and 14 years of frontier work and had nothing in particular to prove and no patience for theater. Reuben said, Anything you have to say to me, you can say in front of my partner." The word landed in the air between all of them. Partner. In this territory at this time, it was a word with a range of meanings. All of them understood, none of them requiring elaboration. The man at the front heard it. His eyes moved from Reuben to Colt and back. Something shifted in his calculation. He said, "Mr. Dane isn't a patient man." Reuben said, "I've gathered that." He said, "My patience is not the issue. The land is not for sale." He said, "If Mr. Dane wants to discuss a water-sharing arrangement, he can come himself and come in daylight." A long moment passed. The horses moved, and the evening wind came through the grass. The man at the front looked at the 2 men on the porch, one calm and immovable, and the other standing with his weight slightly forward and his hand at his side, in the easy, not quite reaching posture of a man who has been in situations like this before and knows exactly when to move and when to wait. The man at the front reined his horse back. He said, "We'll be back." Reuben said, "Come in daylight." They rode off into the dusk, and the sound of hooves faded, and the evening wind continued through the grass as though nothing had interrupted it, because to the land, nothing had. Colt let out a slow breath. He said, "That won't be the end of it." Reuben said, "No." He said, "But he's running out of moves that aren't legal trouble for him." He said, "The water rights are properly filed, and the deed is clean. The only thing Dane can do is keep applying pressure and hope I break." He said, "I won't break." And Colt looked at him. He said, "I know you won't." Reuben said, "The question is whether he decides the effort is worth the cost." Colt said, "Men like Dane don't usually make that calculation until the cost becomes real." Reuben said, "Yes." He said, "We'll have to make it real for him." They sat on the porch in the dark for a while after that, the way they had developed a habit of sitting in the evenings, the particular companionable silence of 2 people who did not require the filling of space between them. The stars came out over the territory. Somewhere south a coyote spoke to something and was answered. The cattle settled in the pen, and old Doss's lamp went out in the barn. Colt said, "When you said partner." Reuben said, "Yes." He said, "You meant it in all the ways it can be meant." Reuben said, "Yes." He said, "Oh, in this territory, that's not without risk." Reuben turned his head and looked at him in the starlight. He said, "Colt." He said, "I have been alone on this land for 4 years, and I made it what I wanted it to be with my own hands, and I was content with it." He said, "Content is not the same as happy." He said, "When I said partner in front of those men, I was saying it because it's true, and because I don't intend to be careful about what's true." He said, "If that creates risk, then that is the risk I choose." Colt sat with that for a moment. He said, "I've been careful about what's true for 15 years. Reuben said, "I know." He said, "I'm done being careful about it." Reuben said, "Good." They sat in the dark, and the stars moved in their slow ancient circuit over the territory, and the wind moved through the grass, and the land was large and quiet around the small warm light of the cabin, and inside that light, inside the specific radius of warmth and fire and the ordinary life that two people were building out of honest labor and clear intention, Colt Devereaux felt something he had no adequate word for, a condition of rightness so complete and so unfamiliar that he kept waiting for it to reveal itself as something temporary, some trick of the light or the exhaustion or the relief of having finally stopped running. It did not reveal itself as temporary. It simply continued to be what it was. 3 weeks after Dane's night visit, a word came from San Marcos that Fletcher Dane had entered into a water-sharing agreement with the Lassiter property to the southeast, which had a smaller creek but a willing owner, and none of the complications the Harlan land presented. The information arrived by way of old Doss, who had been into town for supplies, and had an ear for what moved through the feed store, and the hardware merchant, and the particular informal news network of frontier territories. He reported this information at supper with the satisfied air of a man whose knees had been vindicated. Colt and Reuben looked at each other across the table. Reuben said he found his easier path. Colt said, "Most men do eventually." Doss said, "My knees indicated last Tuesday that the trouble was resolving. He served himself more stew." He said, "They're very reliable on that kind of thing." The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that Colt had never had and had not known he was lacking. He rose before light and started the stove and had the coffee ready by the time Reuben came out. And they sat at the table in the early quiet and planned the day's work in the brief, economical way of people who understand each other well enough to say a thing once. The work was real and satisfying in the way that work is satisfying when it belongs to you, not in the deed sense, but in the deeper sense of a man who has put his labor into a thing and can see the result of it every time he looks across 40 acres of rocky ground made green. He was good at Reuben too, or was becoming good at him. He, living in close quarters with a man who had been alone by choice for 4 years, had its particular challenges, moments of friction when habits of solitude met habits of solitude, and two people who had both spent a long time deciding everything for themselves had to learn the specific skill of deciding things together. They managed it the way practical men manage practical problems, by looking at the thing directly and saying what was true. They were not always graceful about it. They were always honest about it. That was enough. That was more than enough. The fall came to the territory all at once one morning, the air edged with cold, the grass going from amber to brown, the sky a deeper, more serious blue. Colt had spent falls in this territory before, and always found them austere and beautiful. He found this one different. He was inside it differently now, not passing through but belonging to it, the specific belonging of a man who knows where he will be when winter comes. He would be in a small cabin on 40 acres of rocky ground made green, with a man who had been waiting for him at the irrigation channel with his sleeves rolled and his hands in the dirt, who had said, "Come look at this channel," as naturally as if Colt had always been expected, which in some deeper sense he had been. One evening in October, the first hard cold of the season pressing against the cabin windows, Reuben set down the account book he had been working and looked at Colt across the table and said, "I want to ask you something." Colt looked up from the bridle he was mending. Reuben said, "When you rode north 3 months ago." He said, "Before you came back." He said, "Where did you go?" Colt was quiet for a moment. He said, "I went to the Mora Basin." He said, "I camped 2 nights on the high ground above the creek." Reuben said, he said, "And I sat by my fire on the second morning and understood that there was nothing in that direction." He said, "I understood it very clearly and without any particular comfort." He said, "And then I turned around." Reuben looked at him. He said, "What made you turn around?" Colt set down the bridle. He said, "The same thing that made me ride away." He said, "I turned around because I could not stop thinking about you." He said, "The riding away didn't help with that." He said, 3 days of open country between us didn't help with that. He said, nothing I had ever tried helped with that, and I finally understood that the trying was the problem. Reuben said, yes, he said. That's not a small understanding. Reuben said no. He said, it's the only understanding that matters, though. He said, a man can be very efficient at running and still arrive nowhere worth arriving at. Colt said, you sound like you have some experience with that. Reuben said, I built this place around an absence, around the thing I had decided I was not going to have. He said, and then a man from the feed store in March came to my door shaking and said, nothing works. Colt looked at him. He said, nothing works except this. Reuben said, I know. He said, I know that. The fire in the stove clicked and settled. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass with the cold voice of October. Inside, the lamp made its small warm circle, and the account book sat closed on the table, and the bridle lay half-mended on Colt's knee, and none of it mattered, except the 2 men on either side of the table, looking at each other with the clear eyes of people who have stopped pretending. Colt got up from his chair. He crossed to where Reuben sat and crouched beside him and put his hands on either side of Reuben's face, the jaw and the cheekbones and the rough warmth of him, and Reuben's hands came up immediately and covered his the way they always did, certain and unhurried, the specific language of a man who had decided without reservation. Colt said, I spent 15 years being careful about what was true. Reuben said, I know. He said, I'm not going to be careful about it anymore. Reuben said, good. He said, I never wanted you to be careful about it. He said, I only ever wanted you to be here. Colt pressed his forehead to Reuben's. The contact moved through him the way everything with this man moved through him, steady and deep and absolutely real, sinking into the bones and staying there. He felt the breath of him, the warmth of him, the particular gravity of a person who was entirely and precisely what he was, and had chosen to be so, without apology. He said against the small space between them, I'm here. Reuben said yes. He said, you're here. And outside, the October wind spoke through the grass of the Harlan Ranch, and the stars came out vast and unhurried over the high desert, and the territory lay large and cold and magnificent around a small cabin with a warm light in the window, and inside that light, 2 men sat close in the plain reality of what they had built, not with drama or ceremony or any of the public acknowledgments that other lives allowed, but with the daily and undeniable fact of it, the 2 coffee cups on the table every morning, the shared labor of 40 acres, the specific and irreplaceable weight of being known by another person all the way through. It was not the life Colt had imagined at 17 when he had first understood himself and quietly closed a door on that understanding. It was not the life he had constructed carefully through 34 years of building walls and riding fast and trying saloon girls and trying whiskey and trying every direction except the one that led to a door worth knocking on. It was better than any of those lives. It was the only life that was actually his. He had ridden 3 days in the wrong direction and 3 days back and knocked on a door in the dusk with shaking hands and said nothing works and meant I am here, and a man with gray eyes had stepped back to let him in, and the hollow place in his chest had begun, slowly and irrevocably, and with the particular permanence of something finally given its true name, to be something other than hollow. The lamp burned in the window of the Harlan Ranch. The stars moved over the territory. The land was quiet and large, and did not care in the least about the 2 men inside the small, warm cabin, and that indifference was, in its way, the greatest mercy the frontier ever showed. The space it offered, vast and silent and without judgment, to any soul brave enough to stop running and stay.